let's go ahead and welcome William Finnegan to the stage. Good to see you. All right. Well, this should be a fun time tonight. Okay, let's get started.
The old days.
Welcome to the 28th Annual Writers' Symposium by the Sea at Point Loma Nazarene University. I'm Ben Cater, Director of the Honors Program at the university, and with us this evening is William Finnegan, author of Barbarian Days, A Surfing Life, which won the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for autobiography/biography. He's written many other books, including Crossing the Line, A Year in the Land of Apartheid, which was chosen by the New York Times Book Review as one of the top 10 nonfiction books of the year. Cold New World, Growing Up in a Harder Country, which was a finalist for the Helen Bernstein Award for Excellence in Journalism. Dateline Soweto, Travels with Black South African Reporters, and A Complicated War, The Harrowing of Mozambique. William Finnegan, welcome to the Writers' Symposium.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks very much. Thank you.
So in the past, we've had many writers at the symposium who have been interested in the sea, but none quite like you. You've spent much of your time in the ocean, particularly in wave surfing. It's a lifelong obsession. But you've also been a lifelong writer. And so I'm wondering, when did this other obsession, this desire to write, begin?
Seems like they're around the same time, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, we were talking earlier, I spent a lot of time at the beach when I was little around LA, mainly body surfing, but I was also a big reader, and then I started stand-up surfing when I was about 10 or 11, and also started writing, keeping journals and stuff. And in fact, a main motivation, or like the thing that got me off the dime to write this book, was a box that came in the mail just out of the blue, this, I don't know, 20 years ago, from an old friend of mine, my best friend in like high school, junior high school. And he'd found it in his mother's garage, and it was full of letters that I had written to him when I was 13, 14. We'd grown up in LA, and my family moved to Hawaii for a while when I was 13, and I was already surfing by then, so it was just like this dream, surfing in Hawaii. And I would live by the beach. And I don't remember writing these letters at all. And there were hundreds of pages. And I was like, every night I wrote these long things to my friends about, surf, and girls, and the writing was horrendous. I mean, absolutely everything was bitching. Every wave was bitching, every girl was bitching. But it was really dense stuff about my social life at school as well as, and I'd read it and think, did I really surf waves like, I wasn't sure quite what was true. But it all came back, it all came back so richly that I just thought, I've been thinking about writing a surf memoir. This is the first chapter. And it was heavily based on those letters. Mm-hmm. And so I was, quite young, writing more than I write now. Mm-hmm. And I didn't even remember doing so. So it was around the same time.
Was it in your youth, maybe in your early adolescence when you're doing all this writing, that you first had thoughts of becoming a professional writer one day?
I didn't have any sort of practical thoughts about how to make a living writing for many years. I wrote 3 novels without any encouragement from anyone. I mean, really big. Like the first one was 1,200 pages. I wrote it longhand, and I typed it up, and I was really intent on this thing, but professionalism was not my style. Mm-hmm. I would put these things in a drawer. When I was done with them, maybe some lucky friend would get to read it. I didn't even know what really a publisher was. I didn't know what an agent was. Mm-hmm. So that was quite a ways away yet. I was in my 20s before I started to think, oh, well, maybe, I should get more realistic. But I was very shy to have anybody read my stuff. I published a few little things and, poems and stories in college news, magazines and stuff, but I was really insecure and didn't know what I was doing and didn't have any practical sense of how this could. I did everything. I had jobs.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that you read a fair amount as a kid. What did you read?
I read a ton of sports books when I was little, and all the kind of Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn type classics. And I also read. I later realized a lot of girls' books, which they were pitched to girls, sort of Victorian American, like Pollyanna, and that whole. I loved those books. That was kind of a secret from my friends, and I only realized it later. I had a whole shelf of girls' books that I loved.
Do you want to go deeper with that?
With my shrinks, yeah.
Okay, that's right. So were there particular authors that sort of looking back, or maybe even you have a sort of a conscious memory of this as a child, really you tried to imitate?
When I was young? Yeah, I was an English major in college, and even before that, I found some mentors and was reading, T.S. Eliot and more difficult writers, and so I would try to imitate them, hopeless, this 15-year-old kid in L.A. trying to write like T.S. Eliot. And then at some vulnerable point around the same age, I stumbled onto Jack Kerouac and tried to write like him. I had a whole series of, mainly poets, and I would try to translate that stuff into prose when I realized that I was a terrible poet. That took a while. And it was all just mixed up with the stuff that was going on in my life. I'd be writing about, heartbreak as I was getting my heart broken, but all very displaced too into fiction. So it was a long process before I realized that what happened, if you're interested. I wrote these 3 novels, and the third one was like almost publishable. I was getting toward the idea of like, how about something that people might want to read, as opposed to, and so it was close, and it was about working on the railroad, which I'd done for a few years, and around the time I was finishing that one, I'd been bumming around surfing for years, and after I left the railroad, and working on this novel. And I got a job teaching in a high school in a black township outside Cape Town in the bad old days of apartheid. This is 1980. And it was a real life-changing year for me. It was intensely political. The kids at our school and then other schools and then all through the country went out on strike against apartheid in education. And it ended up being quite a violent confrontation with the state, including in the township where I worked. And I really admired some of the activists, both my colleagues and some of our students and other people I got to know in the community. And it was just so intense that by the time that year was over, I just wasn't interested in the kind of romantic fiction I've been writing. I just was interested in politics, broadly speaking, power, questions of power. I started writing essays and nonfiction, and even selling some of it to American magazines that I'd never seen. This was in the long before internet or anything like that, and so I just kind of write letters to friends. Are there any magazines that might be? Yeah, try these guys, and I'd send off this stuff. And I wasn't writing about South Africa. I didn't feel like I had a right to that. I was so caught up in things there. And didn't trust. I'd been out of the U.S. for a number of years, and I kind of didn't trust the American motive to want to read about the miseries of the oppressed in South Africa. And so I wrote about other stuff, but I was starting to find my voice a little bit as a nonfiction writer, and also reading more literary nonfiction and realizing, man, this is better than T.S. Eliot,
So I think it's probably in the early 80s in which your headspace is in South Africa and the issues of racial injustice going on there. One of the things that I was really interested in is that you spend a good portion of your life from early adolescence really through, maybe even through today, being deeply devoted to surfing and deeply devoted to writing, but even early on and then through the 80s, and not until the 1990s, do you really seem to treat surfing as a serious topic of literary inquiry?
Yeah. Well, I didn't see it as such a topic at all. In fact, I didn't really even. It's a little much to say I never thought about surfing, because at one level it kind of ran my life. I mentioned that I was traveling around for years, surfing all over the place, and kind of just this classic surf bum, camping and chasing waves life. But that was strange. I was kind of following through on a sort of childhood dream, the endless summer. I don't know how many of you got your lives warped by that film, which was fiction. I thought, oh, these guys just dropped everything and traveled around the world. And of course, it was like a photo shoot. They were two pro surfers that got hired to do this job. I figured that out many years later. But my best friend, also a writer, Brian DeSalvatore, also was under the influence of that. And so for years, we, both working on our novels and doing what we're doing and saying, we got to take that trip. We got to make that big trip. And finally, I don't know, I was probably mid-20s, and he was older than that. And we finally went. And went for a long time, and he actually went back to the U.S., and I just kept going for years and years of this idea. And Cape St. Francis, this great wave, well, it's actually Jeffreys Bay, figures in that movie, and I surfed there a lot as part of this kind of, I don't know what, but I didn't think about it. And I thought of myself as a writer. The surfing was just this thing I did and couldn't sort of help myself. And but I never talked to anybody about it except other surfers, like Brian or somebody, like people would understand. I didn't think it would interest anyone else ever. And I became a little bit ashamed of it later when I came back to the U.S., was freelancing and starting to publish a lot and got on staff at the New Yorker and was writing about politics. And I realized, because I had an assignment to write a profile of a surfer, and I thought, do I want to come out of the closet as a surfer at this point? Because I was locked in these kind of public policy debates with other policy geeks, but in public. And so I didn't want to have them suddenly say, oh, wait a second, you're just a dumb surfer. We don't need to, argue with you anymore. And so it was somewhere in there. And I finally did write this profile of a surfer. And that was when I realized that it was possible to write about surfing for non-surfers in a way that kind of engaged me and really engaged them. And the first piece I did, that big profile of the guy I used to surf with in San Francisco, was also about, like, how serious are you about surfing? He was super serious about it and always on my case, because I surf with them all the time, but I said, no, I don't need another board. No, I mean, surfing, what's, but he was saying, no, it's everything. So that was sort of the subject of that first piece. And that was around the time I realized, oh, it is possible to write something interesting about surfing.
I want to come back to that, but real quick, just let's provide a sense of chronology here. So in 1974, you completed a bachelor's degree in literature from UC Santa Cruz, and then 8 years later, a master's of fine arts from the University of Montana.
No, not 8 years later, more like
78?
4 years later, yeah.
Yeah, 78, that's what I meant, 1978. By 1984, you're a contributing writer to The New Yorker, and then you go full-time on staff in 1987?
Yes.
So I guess, was there a particular incident or sort of was there a person who convinced you to go ahead and write this profile on Doc Renneker?
Oh, that was it was sort of a fluky thing. I was freelancing, I was living in California, here we are. I was living in San Francisco, and I was in Nicaragua for another magazine and got an idea for a short piece for the New Yorker and just wrote it up, sent it over the transom, and they took it. So I was thrilled. I really wanted to write for them. And somebody in the editor's office said, the editor likes your writing. If you want to write anything longer, which I did, she said, now's a good time to propose it. And I thought, now, was now, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, now. And I couldn't think of anything. And I was surfing with Mark all the time, this big wave surfer, this colorful guy. He was a physician, very smart, and he just suddenly struck me as I don't know if any people remember, sort of like vintage John McPhee, heroes, these like brainy outdoorsmen, and I just thought, I got a brainy outdoorsman right here. So I proposed it, and they said, and I kind of played them up, and they said, yeah, okay, and they gave me an assignment. And then I thought, ooh, I don't want to do that. I did the reporting and moved to New York and just thought, I really don't want to do that. It took me 7 years to write, which is, I had to miss a few deadlines. And I did write like 2 or 3 books during those 7 years. So I was doing other things, but that's how it happened, but then I had to come around and actually do it.
So my understanding is that the series of articles that you're referencing, Plain Doc's Games, came out in 2 pieces in the New Yorker in the early 90s.
Yeah.
And you were a little apprehensive in publishing it, but my understanding is that it's had a very wonderful shelf life even today. It had an immediately very popular, very positive reception, and it continues to be one of the most downloaded articles in New Yorker's history. Is that the case?
Maybe, yeah.
So did it feel good to be so wrong about your initial thought that this would not be taken seriously nor enjoyed?
Well, it was nice to be wrong about the idea that people were going to say, you're disqualified. That didn't happen. Nobody cared. But another reason it took a long time to finish was while writing it, began to realize Mark's not going to like this. I couldn't find a way to shade some of the truth of the situation there, that little community and his character, that wasn't going to really bother him. And so I didn't want to finish it because I didn't want to make him mad. And that happened. So that was no fun. He hated it. And it was, yes, so I had to deal with him and feeling bad about it and arguing with him. And it was sort of slowly dawned on me. It was kind of I think part of what happened was that it got passed around. A lot of people read it. New York's got a big readership. But surfers started seeing it. And that contributed to the long shelf life, because, I'm sure there are plenty of surfers here and plenty of people who suffer the companionship of surfers. And that, we've got our own language and our own understanding of how to talk about the ocean and so on. And I think a lot of people started reading, like, oh, what's this bullshit, this surfing in the New Yorker? And they start reading, and I heard this a lot. In the first paragraph, oh my God, this is one of us. It's like, this is a member of the tribe. Oh my, and it's right down to, you get all the not pronouns, what's the word I want? The prepositions right. In, on, up, down, all those things you get right because it's your native tongue. You can't get them wrong, but nobody else can get them right. I don't know if you've noticed this, but the New York Times says, okay, we're going to do some things about surfing. Every caption, every preposition is wrong. He's paddling up to go surf. No, he's not paddling up. And it's hard to get, but if you speak the language, you just do it. So I think people would start into that and go, oh my, this guy's one of us, and then they'd read it, and it was this, full-blown thing that not everybody loved, but it grabbed a lot of people to see surfing written about like that.
And even sort of the paper of record, the New York Times, can really get surfing wrong. And there's a lot of
and they try. They'll go out and consult surfers. We have this caption right? Yeah. And then they have it wrong.
Yeah, and there's this incredible ignorance in some surf writing. But on the other hand, there's a lot of surf writing that's just purple. It's just totally over the top. It's overblown, and it doesn't really sort of capture maybe the authenticity or the simplicity or the profundity of the activity. You managed to write about surfing incredibly well.
Thank you. Simplicity, that's important.
What I'd like to do real quick is just read one passage here that I found just incredibly vivid and poignant and very effectual. You can see it on the screen behind me. You write, a long period swell had arrived overnight. The sets were well overhead, glassy and gray with long walls and powerful sections. I was so excited to see the excellence that my backyard spot could produce that I forgot my usual shyness and began to ride with the crowd at the main peak. I wasn't strong enough to hold on to my board when caught inside by 6-foot waves and spent much of the afternoon swimming. Still, I stayed out till dusk. I even caught and made a few meaty waves. And I saw surfing that day by Leslie Wong, among others, that made my chest hurt. Long moments of grace under pressure that felt etched deep in my being, what I wanted somehow more than anything else. That night, while my family slept, I lay awake on the bamboo-framed couch, heart pounding with residual adrenaline, listening restlessly to the rain.
Did anybody here ever see Les Wong surf? Oh, man. He's a few years older than me. I was like 13 on a longboard with no leash in Hawaii.
I'm curious about the relationship between riding a wave and writing a sentence. It might sound poetic to sort of make the comparison, but is it true? Is there a real relationship between the two?
Well, in my mind there is. I don't know about in the world. A good sentence has a certain shape. It can be long, it can be short, but it's got a sort of crispness of line and a sort of control that can be really subtle. And the same thing's true about a good ride in the water. They can be short, they can be long, but a good one when you're on it. A good wave which you surf decently, and the line is the one you wanted to draw, and so in my mind there's a strong parallel. Mm-hmm. But I don't know if it carries for anyone else.
I think at some level the parallel, or at least sort of the comparison, begins to break down, or maybe it's actually fortified, because on the one hand you say that in writing there's an element of control, and sometimes you have that in surfing, but I would say that as in surfing, you're not really sure what the wave's going to do. You're not really sure what you're writing, what it's going to turn out to be. And so maybe actually the comparison becomes stronger in that regard.
Yeah, there is that part too. When a sentence comes out well, you think, ooh, how did that happen?
Exactly.
And when a wave goes really well, you think,
how did that happen?
Yeah, there's that quality. And yeah, the kind of dancing or fainting with the language, mm-hmm. Is a lot like, the wave is this force, sometimes fearsome, sometimes not, but is this natural phenomenon that's happening, and often happening very fast, and you're reacting to it, and that it starts to break down around there, mm-hmm. because language is not comparable, but the pleasure, the thrill of getting it right. Mm-hmm. Or the frustration of getting it wrong.
Let's get into Barbarian Days. The title is curious. When did you decide this is going to be the title of my memoir?
Around the time the publisher was saying, "What's the title?"
So it wasn't obvious.
No. And I'm not any good at titles, and it seemed okay, and thematically it seemed just right. Mm-hmm. There's a famous quote that I toss in there from an early missionary. Hiram Bingham went to Hawaii in the early 19th century from New England, and deplored surfing, used the word barbarian to describe this thing that the missionaries disapproved of, and really focused on. A lot of you probably know this as a main dissipation of the indigenous people there. That this is exactly what they should not be doing. They should not be playing. They should not be half naked. They should be working in the fields for money, basically. And so surfing was this contested thing, and that was this barbarian thing. And so there's that. Mm-hmm. And then the whole book, broadly speaking, I see as like a main theme is a kind of struggling myself against responsibility so that I can surf, and struggling against the urge to surf so I can be a citizen and write and do something worthwhile, because serving's pretty self-indulgent. And so the Barbarian Days are I'm just out in nature and I don't care about your society or your empire or the rest of it, outside the walls of the city, so to speak. And that's kind of what I'm bringing to readers who don't know anything about it. But I'm also writing about this, I don't write about my work in here really at all. Just you sort of notice the progression of it, but I don't. People who read this, some of them were disappointed. They said, I thought we could read all about office politics and affairs and stuff at the New Yorker. You're on the inside there. Why did That's not what I did.
Okay. So when you're working out your ambivalence about surfing, at least as you're experiencing it in the book, it comes across as certainly a mental process, but also a social one. You're sort of working out these tensions in the context of all these different friendships, one in particular with who you referenced momentarily ago, Doc Renneker. Doc Renneker, the big wave surfer, the doctor, the family practice doctor of San Francisco, he tried to purify you. He sort of sought to evangelize you, to help you make surfing more integral and seamless in your life. There's a terrific quotation I'd like to read. And you can see Doc Renneker up on the screen here. You write, Mark was provoked by my perceived lack of seriousness, my casual half-assedness about surfing. Wasn't I the guy who had done the big safari, the circumnavigation in search of far-flung waves? I was. And he was the guy who had stayed put and gone to med school. But that didn't mean that surfing was essential to my existence as it was to his. My ambivalence about the sport we shared appalled him. It was heresy. Surfing, to begin, was not a sport. It was a path. And the more you poured into it, the more you got from it. He himself was exuberant proof of that. There's a question in here. I'm curious, do you feel that Barbarian Days did actually give you adequate space to work out your misgivings about how much time you had devoted to surfing and the outsized role it played in your life, or do you still have some misgivings about it?
I think it did. That was a main reason to try to write this, was to try to account for all these years. I mean, 50 years or something by the time I wrote this, that I'd spent, chasing waves. And what was all this, So that was like a main motivation for writing the book the way I did. And I felt like I did kind of account for it. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of, it's a sort of a tongue-in-cheek thing about the obsession where, the chapters are almost all built around friendships. This guy I surf with a lot. That was my idea. It was going to be a guy, a wave. That was going to be like the structure of the book. And then I had a girlfriend who completely took over chapter 3 and blew that out. But anyway, I was going to look at these things and sort of tell the story of my life, but strictly through surfing. And so I make these little jokes where, I'll start a new chapter 10 years after the last one ended and say, oh, and I got married and a couple other things in there. And, but the important thing is I found a new wave. There's a lot of that right. Kind of pretending like surfing is the only thing. And then backing away from that and being more sincere. Mm-hmm. But it's, by the end of this, I felt like I'd accounted for all this dissipation that I could feel guilty about. And then when the book did well, suddenly it became, oh, I'm making money out of this, So it's not so just totally self-indulgent, not taking care of my family sort of thing. And also suddenly it became, I'd been, lying to my editors for many years, where were you? Where's the piece? The deadline? Oh, the answer, of course, is I went surfing. Waves got good, sorry. But I couldn't say that for many, many years. And after this book did well, suddenly it was like, hey, The waves were good. I'm Mr. Surf, remember?
Yeah. Winning a Pulitzer Prize is sort of like the ultimate hall pass.
Yeah, so I haven't felt that guilty lately.
Good for you. So you're a journalist, and you cover essentially humanitarian crises. You cover very serious topics, both domestically and internationally. Was it challenging to write a memoir?
Yeah, it was, and to write about surfing generally. This went for that profile of Mark back in the day, and then this book, which took me like 20 years to write. It was really hard to justify spending all this time writing about this, because I have often written about big humanitarian crises. I mean, like wars and subjects that just, have their own, there's a reason why you need to do this, and you need to do it now, and get it done as fast as possible, and do it as well as you can, because it's an urgent topic. And like surfing is about the least urgent topic you could, so it's really hard to justify. I'd get into it for a while, and pretty soon I would just feel, sort of disgusted with myself, thinking, oh, Honolulu Bay, yeah, when there was like serious work to do. So that was this kind of alternation, allowing myself to work on this, and then realizing I can't justify this. I've got, there are much more important things to do.
There is a lot of very personal heavy lifting in the book. You document some personal shortcomings. For instance, when you head out to Europe, you said that you were a tyrant on the road. And, you basically, you're straight up and you say, I kind of bailed on my girlfriend for a while because I wanted to do something else. But you also sort of aired the dirty laundry of other folks. All of this sounds like a minefield. All of this sounds incredibly complicated. How did you navigate that?
I'm worried about what you said, aired the dirty laundry of other folks, because this is a huge issue.
Maybe I misread it.
No, I'm sure I did. But memoir is a very weird genre for a reporter, because you're basically reporting out your own life, like what really happened. But it's private life, none of this was on the record. And you're arrogating to yourself the right to put this stuff out there for the world. And so, all these private moments shared with, friends and loved ones. So I had to go back to people and go over what happened, and people, plenty of people would say, you can't write about that. I never told my kids about that, and I'd say, okay. I try not to cross those lines. And then other people completely surprise you. Like, it wasn't actually the American edition, but the British have these tougher libel laws. And so the book was coming out in Britain, and the lawyers there said, oh, no, not this and not that. And one thing they didn't like, I described my girlfriend's mother's life as one long middle-aged orgy. And they said, did she sign off on this? And I said, she doesn't know. And they said, it's not okay. So, all right. So she's here in California. And so I kind of tiptoed toward her and said, and she said, you wrote that? You put that in a book? Yeah, she said, that's great. She was like 91, and she was like happy to be remembered that way. So you never know.
So it sounds like you've maintained friendships with the people who are in the book.
A lot of them, yeah, but some of them are kind of...
Not every one of them.
Yeah, some of them are sort of frenemies. But I went back to people, and these negotiations could get very dense, around the question of, like, whose story is this to tell, And, of course, everybody remembers everything differently. That's, like, guaranteed. No, you were there, I was, this is like scientific fact that nobody can remember anything the same way. And so there's all that. And some really tricky ones, like, I remember I went over and over and over this scene where my high school sweetheart had we'd found her father who'd been missing for years. It was this super dramatic scene. And we got over it and over it and over, she and I, and found, okay, that's all what happened. And half what she said is not what happened, but okay, that's what happened. And then I got a last note from her saying, oh, just one more thing. You weren't there. What do you mean? I wasn't there. you weren't there. And she said, you must have been there some other time. And I realized she'd been going through this and, writing about it and talking to her shrink about it, whatever. This is like a huge thing in her life. I wasn't important to it, and I'd like drifted out of the picture and said, this is what happened. And so I had to think, this is hers. She has far more narrative right to this than I do. So I lose a good scene and just kind of smudge it and leave it go. So the
Sure.
negotiations get quite complicated. What do you have a right to?
My first impression, or one of my first impressions when I was reading Barbarian Days, was that friendship is just this powerful theme throughout the book. You document sort of your search for really good waves with a whole variety of peoples. It sounds like this is sort of a tale of a core of discovery. There's one passage in particular that I would like to read that sort of gets at sort of the friendship that's embedded for the search for the perfect wave or really good waves. And it has to do with you and Brian stumbling upon Tavarua.
Oh, yeah.
We turned and trained our binoculars on the tiny island across the channel. We were looking straight into the wave. It was coming from the northwest, having wrapped nearly 180 degrees. It was a long tapering, a very long, very precisely tapering left. The walls were dark gray against a pale gray area. This was it. The lineup had an unearthly symmetry. Breaking waves peeled so evenly that they looked like still photographs. There seemed to be no sections. This was it. Staring through the binoculars, I forgot to breathe for an entire 6-wave set. This, by God, was it.
That, by the way, is not the wave. That's cloud break.
That's cloud break.
Yeah.
So you're talking about restaurants?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, there was no restaurant at the time, but
It becomes restaurants.
it was an uninhabited island.
There's this old adage that really only a surfer gets the feeling. And when I read that, and frankly, even when I just read it, I got the feeling. The excitement, the longing, the sense of urgency to just get out there, paddle out. I'm practically frothing right now. But you did write Barbarian Days for a general audience.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I guess you assumed that some surfers would read it. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Were you apprehensive about how it might be received by the surf community?
No. No, I mean, I had individual apprehensions, but I don't even, surf community,
What is that?
Yeah, what is that? Somebody asked me on the radio the other night, here in San Diego, I think, I don't know if it ever aired, something about, is surfing getting, what was, these questions about surfing, like it was this thing, and I couldn't picture it, and the same thing with surfing community. Some surfers will like it, some surfers will hate it. I've certainly had non-surfing readers, some old lady will say, too much surfing, like, didn't, it was, and so there's those people you can't possibly hold. Mm-hmm. But the hope was to bring people into it, kind of slowly and have like by that point in the book, maybe halfway through the book, you either care or you don't. Oops, sorry. And we've been looking for waves for a long time in the South Pacific, and never thought we'd find something like that. And then we stumbled onto it, and I'm just hoping readers are into it. They've been sweating through many an island and many a crummy wave, and camping in the mud, and then here it is, and I think people will. And then I actually really enjoyed writing about Tavarua. Mm-hmm. It's by far the most kind of rapturous surf writing, I think. It was pretty rapturous experience, but able really to get into it and hope readers would come along. Mm-hmm. Because it's a little kind of paradisal and icky, maybe, I think, for some people. But it was something I wanted to get right. Mm-hmm. And Brian says he hasn't read the book. So I don't know if I got it right. He's the one who will be able to say. Mm-hmm. He's the only other person there. But he says he hasn't read it.
Were you surprised that you won the Pulitzer Prize?
Yeah, I was. Very surprised. And my editor called me and told me he seemed pretty surprised too. And he'd been very high on it when he'd read it and he excerpted it, and very high on it. And so he made me feel like I'd written a great book before it was published. The first person that made me feel like that. And but then, I don't know. I think it probably when the awards ceremony came along some months later, there's kind of like people circulating, and I talking to a guy who I'd always admired, editor or columnist at the Washington Post, and he said, "I really liked your book." And I said, "Oh, thanks." He said, "No, I really liked your book." And I said, "Thanks," and he just, like, this guy's stupid. He was saying, like, "I voted for your book, man. I was on the committee. You owe me," And it was also sort of like, and you would never think me as like older black guy from the South, like doesn't know anything about serving, couldn't care less, but he also like knew my work through the years. Mm-hmm. And I think in the citation it sounded a little bit like, he's been around, he's done a bunch of good stuff, and I did this. Mm-hmm. So maybe it wasn't just, mm-hmm. That's how I got it. But it didn't occur to me to like go with the politics of like who's on what committee and why don't we just give it to that guy? I don't know. I don't know who the competition was or what.
How has winning a Pulitzer Prize impacted your literary career?
I haven't noticed anything.
Mm-hmm. Except for you being able to say, yeah, I was surfing and that's why I missed the deadline.
Yeah, there's that. And maybe, I don't know, some doors open.
Okay.
I get invited to come here. I don't know.
Yeah.
The Pulitzer weighs into that. Probably a lot, actually, mm-hmm. that kind of stuff. But mostly I'm just doing my same old work. The Pulitzer Prize is long forgotten, and deadlines are just as hard, and writing's just as hard.
I'd like to pivot and talk a little bit about surfing. Barbarian Days reads like a love letter. I had a wonderful conversation with my neighbor across the street, and both she and I were sort of riffing on how clearly love comes through passion, exuberance, are sort of dominant themes in the book. And there are so many quotations that I could read that sort of capture this idea, but I'd like to read just one or two here. You write early in the book, and this is when you were a youth, "But I was lashed to its moods now. The attachment felt limitless, irresistible. My utter absorption in surfing had no rational content. It simply compelled me. There was a deep mine of beauty and wonder in it. Beyond that, I could not have explained why I did it." It sounds like you're falling in love.
That was, I think, a passage about leaving the church.
Afterwards.
Wasn't that the end of the passage about leaving the church?
That's right. And it's sort of like surfing filled some sort of a psychic cavity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I was 13, Catholic, raised Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
After confirmation, which happens when you're 13, my parents said, "So now it's up to you whether you go to Mass." I said, "What?" I'd gone to Mass my whole life, and I had 3 younger siblings who were all, dragged to Mass every Sunday. And I said, "Really?" And they said, "It's up to you. You're an adult in the eyes of the church." And I said, "You hypocrites. You actually don't believe any of this, do you?" Anyway, I never went to Mass again, and to this day. And accounting for that moment, it's a little hokey, I suppose, but when I think of my life at that moment, this seemed true. Mm-hmm. That it wasn't like I was getting a great deal out of going to Mass.
Yeah.
But I was kind of rooted in these Catholic beliefs that I had drilled into me, and suddenly it was not certain that all this was true. And what did I have? Well, the family's going off to Mass, I'm going surfing.
Right.
And this is really where I am.
Mm-hmm.
So, at the time, I would not have said, the church, sir, I would not
Sure.
have made that. But looking back.
Yeah. Well, and over time, I think that sort of sense that surfing filled this incredible sort of vacuum in your life. is definitely true. Another quotation I'd like to read. Most sessions were unremarkable. What was consistent was a certain serenity that followed a rigorous session. It was physical, this post-surf mood, but it had a distinct emotionality too. Sometimes it was mild elation. Often it was pleasant melancholy. After particularly intense tubes or wipeouts, I felt a charged and wild inclination to weep, which could last for hours. It was like the gamut of powerful feelings that can follow heartfelt sex. Is surfing just about riding waves?
No, not for me. I mean, there's all the context. Both being in the water, not riding waves, and just trying to stay tuned to the ocean. And there's chasing waves, there's going here, going there. And then there's all the feelings associated with a surf session, which can also be frustration and self-disgust or whatever, or you're mad at somebody who dropped in on you. But that's hearing that passage that still rings quite true, and especially true in cold water. It's dead of winter in New York. I surfed some kind of juicy waves last week and got pounded, and afterward just felt completely kind of taken apart. But it was all that too. It was just this emotionality. And like that night, I was like, what's with me? What's going on? Oh yeah, today. And I didn't even get any good waves. I just got worked a lot in cold, like really cold water, and it just, the feeling afterward wasn't so blissful, but it's still that strong.
Point Loma is a Christian liberal arts university devoted to educating the entire person, mind, body, and soul. You talk a little bit about sort of the intellectual work of surfing. There seems to be a type of ocean literacy that you need in order to surf well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably everybody here understands this, that there's this, athletic part of surfing, but the main thing everybody's doing out there, if you're driving by and you see a bunch of people in the water, is they're trying to figure out what's going on. They're trying to figure out what the ocean's going to do next, trying to understand, and all the variables, the tide, the swell, the wind, the swell period, the size, the angle, the bathymetry of your local spot or the spot you happen to be at. And I surf a lot of sandbars now, so it's really complicated around New York because these bars are always moving. And I'm not going to tell these other guys because I think the waves are going to be good over there. All that stuff, the intellectual work of surfing, just to do it, and then to kind of get in tune with what the ocean's doing, and because there's often a sort of pattern, and it could be just so complicated you can't figure out. Oh, there's going to be a good wave in 3 minutes. It doesn't work like that, but to get close to that and to be in the right spot.
And the adaptive attunement, to borrow a phrase from a philosopher at UCI who's a very devoted surfer, a guy named Aaron James, it certainly applies to sort of your becoming attuned to what's going out in the water in terms of waves and bathymetry and really, frankly, even what like the animals and the various flora are doing. Yep. But there's also this sort of social dimension, right? There's like a social sort of contract in the lineup. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about adaptive attunement in relation to other surfers?
Sure. It's very different in different places. I've found around New York, where I've been living for a long time and surf regularly, it's pretty easy. People aren't very aggressive, and despite the bad reputation of New Yorkers, people are super mellow in the water. I've never seen a harsh word spoken in 30 years surfing there. And people are a little lame too. They hoot at things that aren't really that exciting. But that's nice, right? I mean, they don't have the superciliousness that we all kind of like cultivate in California and Hawaii. Yeah, it's you remake it every time. And in places that are more intense than a lot of the spots I surf now, you have, there's the pecking order you got to work out. There's the way you got to sort of respect other people's privacy, what they're going through, the movie they're living, how much it means to them, and kind of, if you're inclined to like sort of give them recognition, give them some props at a given moment, it kind of really mean a lot. It means a lot to me when it happens. And it's usually, some places are changing, and I find myself surfing with a lot of women, but in general, in my life, it's been mostly men. And I really want to surf with some of these like red hot surfing women, like women who surf better than 90.
Like really talented.
Like 99.9% of men don't surf as well as Chris Moore or whomever. And the kind of alpha thing that can be pretty primitive in the lineup. I'd love to see when, Carissa, just to use her as an example, multi-world champion, wonderful surfer. She could be out with 50 guys in an intense lineup at Haleiwa, say, and she's the best surfer out. So she gets, and all these guys who are, she's not going to beat them up, but she outsurfs them. So I want to see that dynamic, how it works. But it's also if you're surfing with friends, it's different again. Sure. I'm talking about surfing with strangers right here now, and in fact in this book, I mentioned that virtually every section, every chapter is built around a friendship as well as like a place to surf, and because I realized that I had no interest in writing about surfing in a vacuum, which is just say surfing alone. It's like without somebody to triangulate this with, without a friendship through which this is being refracted, it's just not interesting. It's, I got another wave, and I got a good wave, and I got a bad. It's just I can't make it. Even though I love surfing alone, actually, my concentration is better and whatever. I couldn't write about it. It was too. And I actually discovered in a pack of letters that my friend Brian gave back to me when I told him I was writing this, that I'd written to him from South Africa when I was hanging around Jeffreys Bay. I couldn't believe what great waves I got. I'd kind of forgotten. And just day after day, 8 foot again. 4 of us out all day. This is back in the days when Jeffreys wasn't crowded. And day after day after day, and I'd never even considered writing about it because I didn't have any friends there. I told you I was caught up in this political struggle, and all the other surfers pretty much were white, and I didn't really want anything to do with them. And so I didn't have any friends, and I surfed alone, and so there was nothing to say. Strange. So the social part is crucial in all kinds of ways.
Right. Kind of going back to sort of what you were saying about the ability to read a room, the ability to sort of read a lineup, to sort of adjust, adapt to sort of the mood in the lineup. As part of a literacy, if you will. A lot of that sort of reading is, again, reading body language. You go on to say that so much of what takes place in surfing or in the water is ineffable. Language is no help. It seems that surfing has sort of this transcendent quality. I'm curious, do you consider surfing sacred, spiritual? Is it a divine gift?
For some people it is. And for me at times. I can't generalize, though. Again, as probably everybody knows, you run into some real schmucks in the lineup. Guys for whom I don't think that statement could hold. Just jerks. Who aren't necessarily 100% jerks throughout their lives, but they're not, impressive characters to surf with. And you think, I'll go over there just so I don't have to surf with this guy. And so, it's kind of each person having their own. There's something on offer, certainly, especially when the waves are good. But just generally, being in the water, there's a depth and intensity of experience that is there even when the waves aren't great, if you're open to it.
Yeah, it sounds like it sort of has a message for those who have ears to hear.
Yeah, exactly. And some of the people I've surfed with a lot, there's this guy Peter I write about who I went to Madeira with in the 90s. He's got a, not at all, sanctimonious, but he's got this wonderful kind of depth of feeling about surfing, and not coincidentally, he's a really good surfer, and surfs bigger waves, and just is a real pleasure to be with in the water.
There are so many spiritual / religious references in the book. I'd like to just read a couple. In the beginning of the book, you write, by 13, I'd mostly stopped believing in God, but that was a new development, and it left a hole in my world, feeling that I'd been abandoned. The ocean was like an uncaring God, endlessly dangerous, power beyond measure. You then go on to say that you sort of saw yourself as this sunburnt pagan, privy to mysteries. Much later in the book, you write, once the swells started pumping, large pools of awe seemed to collect around us, hushing us or reducing us to code and murmurs, as though we were in church. There was too much to say, too much emotion, and therefore nothing to say.
That's at Tavarua in Fiji with Brian. Yeah, if you want to read something else, but the pagan reference, that's, again, a reference to the Bingham quote.
That's right,
Yeah,
yes.
Sunburnt Pagans is in the famous sort of denunciation of surfing by this missionary.
Yeah, so you're sort of like reveling in being
that's
precisely that, yeah. It's just a couple more items here to discuss. Several years ago, you profiled arguably the greatest living surfer, the most accomplished, physically talented surfer, Kelly Slater, and his wave pool for the New Yorker, which you referred.
Not my idea; it was my editor's idea.
You're not off the hook though. You refer to the wave pool as theologically dead, and surfing it as not the religious experience one hopes for. What did you mean by these things?
Jeez. I'm both surprised I wrote that and then kind of not surprised because there's, I mean, I don't know how much people have looked at or thought about this Kelly's surf ranch, but he sort of cracked the code to make a perfect wave. And there are all kinds of perfect waves. A lot of these wave pools have proliferated in Europe and in Texas and here and there, and lots of kids want to just do airs. They're not looking for that wave. Like us old guys just want to sit in the barrel. They're looking for something else. So, but for a certain type of surfer, Kelly just absolutely nailed it with this wave that is beyond anything in nature, and not that I wouldn't look at it and say, "Oh, that could be my very favorite wave." It isn't like that. It doesn't have enough character, but it is absolutely mesmerizing. And I guess, in my head and in many other people's heads, I think, promised a kind of religious experience in the sense that I've been trying to get in that spot on a wave like that and stay in there a long time.
Yeah.
My whole life. And now it's being handed to me.
Right.
It's right there.
Yeah.
Not that it's actually so easy to do.
Yeah.
But it's there. And just to watch it, it's a really disorienting wave to watch because it's, that a machine is making it. You've even been up in the control tower and seen them dialing up a different kind of wave. But as soon as I start watching it, I forget about that, and it's just, it's hitting the sandbar. Oh, it's going to fire. Yeah, it's going to fire exactly like it did a minute ago,
Yeah.
But, and all these sort of uncontrollable reactions. But once I got there and kind of wrestled with it and talked to the scientists and the technicians and Kelly and tried to make sense of it, they're having a contest too. It was really less than enchanting, and then they gave me a couple rides, and It was the left's different from the right, and it just was the left more than the right for me anyway. You surf right towards some pilings, both on the right and the left. And the right's my front side, so it's right at you, like trying to get to the pilings, and you never get there. But the right kind of backs away around a sandbar, and the left you're just kind of like surfing next to a pier, but you never get to the pier, and it. Yeah, I felt like there's a funny thing there, and this is going into detail that probably interests no one, but there's a guy who works there who seems to always be there. This Tahitian guy, Raimana, he's this famous big wave surfer from Tahiti, but somehow he's always in Tahiti for the big swells too, but you just never see anything happening at a surf ranch that there's not Raimana on a jet ski running in front of you and yelling at you. And you see the video and you think, this is so horrible. This guy's yelling at you in like broken English, hey brother, you know, like you're not doing something right, and the ski's loud and you can't. But it turns out that's like he's driving the ski and yelling at you, and the iPhone's right there, so and he's trying to video you, so it looks a lot worse than it is. When you're actually surfing it, and he's driving, he's actually yelling useful things if you can hear him over the machine. Hurry up, like the next section, you know, that kind of stuff. And so it's really I don't know, a shit show, we'd say in New York, and it's sort of funny with Rahman if you make the wave, he's pleased with you.
Sure.
Brother, you know, but it's just so far from it.
Well, it sounds so contrived and so artificial.
So contrived,
yeah.
It's so without the. I mean, the passage you read earlier, where I feel kind of lost. I'm losing my religious faith, and I'm kind of turning to surfing. But the ocean is this uncaring God that will soon drown you as look at you. I don't romanticize the ocean in that sense. I mean, I don't turn my back on it. I mean, I'm deeply involved in it. I love it in all these ways, but it doesn't love me. And you always got to, I think, stay clear about that. Especially if you're going to go into juicy waves or dive or do anything seriously engage in the ocean. And yet, the ocean, in its otherness, in its vastness, in its mystery, produces this setting, these beasts that have no, sentience, and yet they engage you like almost nothing. I'm talking about good ways now. And they're so unpredictable, except with everything you know and have learned, they become more predictable, more knowable, more manageable, more rideable, and all of that, and just managing to get it right, being at the right place at the right time, and the wind and the tide and everything else, all of that is surfing. Well, and that surf ranch has none of this. I mean, the wind a little bit.
Well, and I guess the capacity for transformation is very, very high, simply because so much of surfing requires you to yield to something that is so much greater and more powerful than yourself.
Yeah, and all that dynamic's lost in the artificial.
Exactly.
Yes. And it's just, as we talked about it just seems thinner and thinner and sillier and sillier, and yet I understand the kind of Faustian madness of Kelly to try to do this thing. And he did it. I mean, the guy is not only the best surfer ever, he's some kind of genius. I mean, he hired the geniuses, but he drove it for like 10 years in secrecy.
Thad Ziakelski,
Yeah.
who I believe has a PhD from Yale in literature, reviewed Barbarian Days for the New York Times, calling it surfing's confessions. I guess that makes you surfing St. Augustine?
It's funny, I don't remember that, but I do remember when my editor, I said, read the book before he excerpted it, and he liked it, and he wrote this whole thing, and he described it. It's so funny, I don't remember this at all, but he said, this is like reading Augustine's Confessions, St. Augustine with a shortboard. and it always stuck in my mind. It was in a letter I got in extremis. I mean, I was in complete desolation at 18,000 feet elevation, I think, in the Andes, and freezing and like not getting my story and totally miserable. And then I got this email that somehow came up the mountain from my editor calling me St. Augustine with a shortboard. I felt so much better.
What do you want readers to take away from Barbarian Days?
Well, I mean, it sounds trite, but I want them to enjoy it. I want them to sort of get it, like get at some of the, I mean, they might get things that I don't get easily, but to feel some of what I'm trying to convey, to picture some of this, to warm to some of the people I love, whom I describe and do stuff with, and I mean, it's sort of like what one hopes for every book, you know. But this is close because my family's in here in depth and in detail, and I really, you know, didn't want to hurt any of them. So it was important to me that sort of people not go off sideways, which very people did. I mean, didn't get many bad reviews, and you know, the occasional nasty comment, but not. And there are people in the book who didn't like it, which is inevitable, I guess, but very unfortunate. But in general, just hoping that people feel it, and don't, you know, too much surfing and throw it away.
Final question: do you have parting words of wisdom for aspiring writers?
Well, you asked me about deciding to become a writer and a professional writer, and I revealed how incredibly amateurish I was for a long, long time. I mean, like deep into my 20s. I was almost 30 before I began to sort of grow up, and I was living in my parents' basement, you know, kind of freelancing and trying to sort of grow up and write for adults. So don't do it like I did it. I mean, everybody has their own way of getting to it if they're going to be a writer, and their own compulsions that make them want to do it. But I don't seem to, I know lots of young writers, like through the New Yorker and my work in my world, and I don't know anybody as stupid as I was. I've never met any, you know, it's different. I mean, in New York, you get lots of kids coming from good colleges and stuff. And I was just this kind of hick. I went to Santa Cruz back when they didn't have grades, and you could do whatever you wanted. And you could just be as immature as you wanted to be forever, in my case. I feel like younger writers are not prone to the extreme romanticism and kind of getting your own way, and thinking you're great when you're terrible. And all that kind of stuff. Be a little. My father was always on my case to, like, write for the local newspaper. Why would I do that? You know, you got to have an editor. You got to get in print. He'd been a newspaper writer when he was young, and he was kind of living through me as I wanted to be a writer. And later I learned, much later, that when I had some success, that he was very proud of me. He didn't tell me that, but I learned it years later after he was gone, and it just killed me. That he was proud of me, and I wished I'd known it. But early on, he was on my case, you know, to do this stuff that I was actually scared to do, but I disdained, and I should have done. So my advice is follow my father's advice. Write for publication, and you know, take your lumps and think about readers. Because I didn't think about readers for many years, and my stuff was unreadable as a result.
William Finnegan, thank you for being at our Writer Symposium.